The mess hall was alive with the usual early morning chaos, plates clinking, laughter from some of the wolves, the scent of coffee and bacon heavy in the air. Bianca worked her magic in the kitchen, flipping pancakes one-handed while stirring a pot of something savoury with the other. Darren was mid-bite into a stolen biscuit, leaning against the counter with his usual cocky smirk. Rose sat near the back, as always, her coffee half finished, her plate untouched. She was exhausted, still processing everything from the night before. The mission, the reports, the memories that wouldn't let her sleep. She didn't see Lyra at first, didn't hear her enter, but she felt her. The moment Lyra stepped in, Rose's entire world stopped. The second their eyes met the blood drained from her face, the mess hall vanished. It wasn't coffee and bacon anymore, it was chains, cold stone, a collar around her neck, the scent of Draven's chamber, the sting of betrayal. Lyra, the woman she trusted, the woman she loved, the woman who had handed her over to Draven like she was nothing. Lyra had the audacity to smirk. Rose moved before she even realized it. The table shattered as she lunged over it, a blast of raw force sending dishes flying, chairs overturning. Lyra barely had time to dodge. She twisted, narrowly avoiding the first punch, but Rose was faster. Her fist connected with Lyra's jaw. A solid, bone-crunching impact. Lyra staggered back, her smirk vanishing as she wiped blood from her lip. Darren choked on his biscuit. Oh, shit! The mess hall erupted into chaos. Cups smashed. A chair splintered as Lyra slammed into it. Darren, watching this in absolute awe, muttered, "You know, I'd stop this, but this is really entertaining." Eli, finally walking in, paused in the doorway. Took one look at the wreckage. The flames, the flying knives, the two women actively trying to kill each other. She sighed, pulled out her coffee flask and turned the hell around. Nope. But Bianca? Bianca had had enough. A cast-iron pan flew through the air like a freaking missile, slamming into the wall between Rose and Lyra with a skull-rattling clang. Everyone froze. The mess hall fell into absolute eerie silence. Then Bianca stepped forward, knives still in hand, murder in her eyes. She pointed one blade at Rose. "Outside, now!" Then at Lyra. "You too, traitor." Lyra, still catching her breath, had the audacity to smirk. "Damn, I missed you." Rose launched at her again. Bianca tackled them both, and it took 3 wolves, Shade and Darren to pry them apart. Gunnar arrived mid-wrestling match, looked at the absolute hellscape that was the mess hall, and just closed his eyes. "What the hell?" Bianca wiped blood from her forehead, still holding her frying pan. "So help me, Gunnar, if they ever do this in my kitchen again, I will throw them both into the next damn realm." Gunnar sighed. "Both of you? War room? Now." Bianca wiping off her blade. "And clean this goddamn mess." Darren, smirking, stretched as he walked toward the door. "Hey, Bianca, didn't you say you wanted to remodel?" Bianca, with the precision of a trained killer, hurled a cast-iron pan at his head. It barely missed, embedding itself into the wall. Darren, grinning as he walked faster, "Love the new decor." The mess hall was wrecked. Chairs overturned, plates shattered, a table half collapsed in the corner. Burn marks scorched the floor where Rose's fire magic had lashed out. Bianca's prized kitchen, her sacred domain, was in shambles, with one of her best cast-iron pans still embedded in the wall where she'd nearly brained Darren. It looked like a damn battlefield, and that was exactly what Argos, Evelyn, and Caleb walked into. Argos stopped in the doorway, eyes wide as she took in the destruction. Evelyn, still half asleep and clutching a book against her chest, just blinked. "Caleb?" Caleb let out a low whistle. "Welp," he muttered, glancing around. "Looks like someone didn't agree with the daily special." A wooden spoon flew straight at his head. Caleb barely dodged it, hands flying up in surrender as Bianca rounded on them. The woman was furious, hair half falling from her bun, flour smeared across her apron, and a fury in her eyes that could bring an army to its knees. Caleb immediately backed up a step. I, respectfully retract my statement. Bianca exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. You three. Help. Now. Evelyn, already sensing the wrath of the kitchen goddess, immediately set her book down and grabbed a broom. I don't even need context for this, she mumbled. I'm just going to start sweeping. Argos hesitated, still looking at the carnage around them. So, do we, ask? Bianca snapped a glare at her. No. Argos grabbed a mop. Got it. Not asking. Caleb sighed, kicking an overturned chair back into place. This is what happens when I sleep through the fun stuff. Bianca grabbed a fresh rolling pin, one of the few undamaged weapons in her arsenal. Caleb shut up and started stacking plates. And so, under the wrathful eye of Bianca, they got to work cleaning up the remains of a war they completely missed. The walk to the war room was silent, save for the measured steps of those escorting the two women who, given the chance, might have burned the entire workshop to the ground. Gunnar led the way, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable, but everyone in that hallway knew he was pissed. Darren walked beside him. Ever the contrast, his relaxed swagger in full effect, hands tucked into his pockets. He cut his eyes toward Rose, then toward Lyra, then let out a low whistle. So, he smirked. Are we going to address the fact that breakfast came with a full side of chaos this morning? Rose didn't answer. She was too busy burning holes into the back of Lyra's head with her glare. Lyra, for her part, seemed completely unbothered. She walked with her usual graceful confidence, hands clasped behind her back, a smug little smile on her lips. Darren snorted. That's a no, then. Cool. Just checking. Behind them, Shade and Katrina followed, silent observers. But both were tense, their usual cool demeanour laced with caution. Rose was still fuming, her magic simmering just beneath the surface, restrained only by sheer force of will. And Lyra? She was playing it too casual. That meant she was calculating something. The doors to the war room loomed ahead, already open. Inside, Eli, Clara, Desera, and Ashley were waiting, standing near the large holographic display already active in the centre of the room. As soon as Rose and Lyra crossed the threshold, the tension thickened. Eli, leaning against the table with her arms crossed, arched an eyebrow as she looked between the two. So, who won? Ashley smirked, cracking her knuckles. My money was on Rose. Lyra's grin widened, clearly enjoying the attention. Oh, darling, don't be ridiculous. I was just warming up. Rose whipped around so fast that Shade had to physically put a hand on her shoulder before she lunged. Try me, Rose growled. Enough. Gunnar's voice cut through the room sharp as a blade. The weight of it settled everyone down, though Rose still bristled and Lyra, though she obeyed, looked far too amused. Gunnar walked to the centre of the room, placing both hands on the table, his icy blue eyes scanning the gathered team. We've wasted enough time. His voice was firm, controlled, absolute. Shade, Katrina, report. Shade stepped forward, his usual smirk gone, replaced by the cold precision of a man who knew the weight of his words. We found Draven's fortress, he said, and he's preparing for war. The room fell silent. Clara's expression darkened. Ashley leaned forward, interest peaked. Desera narrowed her eyes. Eli, however, zeroed in on the key detail. Define preparing for war. Katrina answered. Weapons, armour, training facilities. He's got forges running non-stop, and his men are drilling in organised combat units, not just mercenaries. He's building an army. Eli muttered a curse under her breath. Clara's hands curled into tight fists. Who's supplying him? Shade exchanged a look with Katrina before answering. Ravina. That single name sent a shockwave through the room. Ashley sat up straight. Desera's expression hardened. Eli's fingers twitched like she wanted to start throwing spells. She paid him a visit while we were there, Katrina continued. She wasn't happy, called him a failure for losing access to Nethoria. Access? Clara frowned. How the hell was he getting into a sealed realm? All eyes turned to Lyra. The smug expression dropped from her face for the first time. She sighed dramatically, rolling her shoulders. Oh, so now I get to talk? What an honor! Rose moved before anyone could stop her. Crack! The sound of her fist connecting with Lyra's jaw echoed through the war room. Lyra stumbled back a step, wiping her lip where a thin trickle of blood appeared. She grinned. Oh, sweetheart. She tilted her head. You have got to work on your right hook. Before Rose could swing again, Darren stepped in, grinning like a madman. Okay, let's not kill the new guest just yet. She might actually be useful. Gunner's patience was done. Enough, he snapped, his gaze locked on Lyra. Talk. Lyra sighed, rubbing her jaw. Fine. I worked for Draven for a time. Back when I still believed he was useful. She glanced toward Eli. Turns out he got his hands on a little something called the Celestial Gem. Eli's entire demeanor changed. Her head snapped to Gunner. Argos! Gunner's expression didn't shift, but internally everything clicked. Argos had stolen the gem. Draven had lost access to Nythoria. That was why Ravina was furious. That was why Draven's men had been hunting her. Lyra smirked at their reactions. Yes, your little goblin thief has been at the center of this the whole time. She examined her nails. Quite an interesting choice of allies. Clara exhaled sharply, her mind already spinning through plans. So that means... She's the reason they can't get into Nythoria anymore, Eli finished. And that means Ravina will be coming for her. Silence. Gunner exhaled through his nose, his fingers tapping against the table. All right, he said finally. The holographic display hummed in the center of the room, casting a pale blue glow over the tense faces surrounding it. Gunner's voice cut through the silence. All right, let's get to work. The plan. Echo Division moves first. Gunner let the weight of that sink in before continuing. We're not waiting for them to make the first move, we go first. The room tensed. Shade and Katrina nodded in agreement. They had seen firsthand what Draven was building. Rose, still steaming from the earlier encounter with Lyra, crossed her arms but grunted approval. Ashley cracked her knuckles. So what's the move? Eli took over. We have 2 problems, so we need 2 teams. Infiltration team, returning to Murk Dusk. Objective, disrupt Draven's war production. Team lead, Katrina. Members, Shade, Lyra, Ashley, Lieutenant Erendil. Tactics, they'd go in fast, precise, surgical. Disrupt the forges, gather intel on troop movements, undermine Draven's ability to mobilize. And most importantly, avoid full confrontation. If they're detected, pull out. Katrina nodded. We hit fast, get what we need, and disappear. No unnecessary fights. Lyra grinned. You do realize I don't do unnecessary, right? Which is why Shade is watching you, Gunner said flatly. Shade just smirked. Defensive team, securing the workshop. Objective, prepare for Ravina's arrival. Team lead, Gunner. Members, Rose, Darren, Eli, Clara, Desira, Argos. Tactics, reinforce defensive positions at the workshop. Prepare countermeasures against Ravina's magic. Ensure that Argos is protected. Eli cut in, pulling up a new display. I'm reinforcing the workshop with every security measure we've got. Wards, sensor drones, magical traps, you name it. Clara nodded. We prepare for every possible outcome. Final words. The briefing was nearly done, but Gunner had one last thing to say. He looked around the room, making eye contact with every single person. This isn't just a skirmish, he said, voice low, steady. This is the beginning of something bigger. Draven is building an army. Ravina is on the move. And we are not going to let them take the first strike. Silence. Then, nodding. Agreement. Determination. Darren, ever the smartass, let out a long sigh and leaned back in his chair. Man, I miss when all we had to worry about was demons and rogue vampires. Rose cracked her knuckles. You'd get bored. Darren grinned. Yeah, probably. The meeting adjourns. Gunnar gave the final order. We deploy at 1900 hours. Until then, gear up, rest up, and be ready. Dismissed. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the war room as everyone rose to leave. The briefing was over and the teams were set. It was time to prepare. Or at least that's what they thought. Sit. Gunnar's voice cut through the movement, sharp and firm. Shade paused mid-step. Katrina raised a brow. Eli's gaze flicked toward Gunnar, sensing something brewing. Darren, of course, had to push it. He gestured loosely between Rose and Lyra. You sure, boss? Because I don't know if you noticed, but these two nearly. Gunnar shot him a look. Darren sighed dramatically and held up his hands. All right, got it. I'll go polish my shotgun or something. Ashley smirked, but no one argued further. One by one, they filed out, until it was just Gunnar and the two women still burning with unresolved fury. Before anyone could speak, the door swung open again. Heavy, controlled footsteps echoed into the room. A massive black wolf entered first. Alpha, the undisputed king of the pack. His ice-blue gaze swept the room, calculating, judging. Beta followed, her golden eyes flicking over everyone before locking onto Lyra. A low huff left her nostrils, unimpressed. Omega trailed behind, younger, twitching with curiosity, until Alpha's low growl stopped him in his tracks. The wolves moved like they owned the place, because in a way, they did. Instead of stopping, Alpha walked past Lyra without even a glance. He strode straight to Rose and sat, not just anywhere, right beside her, close enough that if she so much as shifted, she'd feel the heat of his massive form. Beta followed, mirroring him on Rose's other side. Rose stiffened. What the hell? She expected a snarl, a glare, maybe a condescending huff, because that's all Alpha ever gave her. But not this. She glanced sideways at him, expression wary. No growl, no challenge, just silent, unmoving presence. Lyra, of course, caught on instantly. Her smirk faltered. Her gaze flicked between Rose, Alpha, and Gunnar. Then back to Alpha. Her voice was casual, but her body language, coiled, guarded. Well, damn, she let out, a dire wolf. She turned toward Gunnar, arching a brow. Didn't take you for the type to keep ancient monsters as pets. The moment the words left Lyra's lips, Alpha rumbled deep in his chest. It was not a snarl, it was not a growl, it was a warning. Lyra didn't flinch, but she didn't smirk anymore either. Beta exhaled sharply like she was amused. Omega stood very still. Rose, still trying to figure out what the hell was happening, turned to Alpha. Her arms crossed tightly, her voice flat and suspicious. Okay, seriously, what's your deal? Alpha didn't move. Didn't even acknowledge her question. He just sat there, unbothered, unmoving, present. Beta shifted beside him, stretching lazily, like this was the most natural thing in the world. Lyra, still watching the interaction like a spectator at an arena fight, grinned. Oh, sweetheart, she tilted her head, mock sympathy dripping from her tone. Didn't know you had a fan club. Rose's gaze snapped to her. Shut up! The tension was seconds from boiling over again, but Gunnar had zero interest in round 2. Enough! His voice was calm, firm, absolute. Silence. Rose and Lyra still glared daggers at each other, but neither made a move. Alpha and Beta remained exactly where they were. Gunnar exhaled, already tired of the bullshit. He shifted his focus to Lyra. You and I are going to have a conversation. Now. Lyra arched a brow, tilting her head. Ooh, private time? I'm honored. Lyra took her time entering the conference room, not a single ounce of hesitation in her step. If the earlier fight had rattled her, she wasn't showing it. Gunnar followed behind her, closing the door with a firm, final motion. The war room doors shut, leaving Rose alone with the wolves. The air was thick, heavy with lingering tension and scorched emotions, the remnants of the storm she and Lyra had just unleashed. Rose stood in the middle of the room, fists still clenched, her breath coming hard and uneven. She could still feel the heat of her magic simmering under her skin, still hear the echoes of Lyra's voice in her head, that smug, infuriating voice that had nearly sent her over the edge. She turned, ready to storm out, but then she saw Alpha. The massive dire wolf stood in the doorway, his piercing blue gaze locked onto her with an expression that was unreadable. His usual disdain for her was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he stood between her and the door, unmoving, Rose's brow furrowed. "What?" she snapped, voice sharp, raw from emotion. Alpha didn't move, didn't blink. Beta and Omega lingered behind him, their intelligent eyes scanning her with something close to curiosity. Omega, the youngest, tilted his head slightly, his ears flicking as if trying to understand. Rose exhaled through her nose. "So now you're on my side." She let out a bitter laugh. Hell must have frozen over. Still, Alpha didn't move. The weight of his stare dug into her like an anchor. There was no aggression, no challenge, just presence. A silent declaration. For all his usual contempt, Alpha wasn't letting her out of his protection. And that unnerved her. She had fought against his judgment since the moment she arrived. Alpha had always made it clear she wasn't one of them, wasn't part of their pack. And yet, when it had come down to it, he had chosen her over Lyra. Her throat tightened, but she shook it off. She wasn't about to get sentimental over a damn wolf. So instead, she folded her arms and leaned back against the table, forcing a smirk. "Fine. If you're my guard dog now, make yourself useful and find me a drink." Omega let out a soft huff, almost like a laugh. Beta simply blinked, and Alpha remained where he was. The room was stark, just a table, 4 chairs, and a single overhead light, casting sharp shadows along the walls. Lyra sighed dramatically, running a hand through her golden hair as she leaned against the table. "You know, I was hoping for something a little more dramatic. Maybe an interrogation light, some handcuffs." Her lips curled into a slow, amused smirk. "I know you military types like a good power play." Gunnar didn't react. He simply walked to the chair opposite her and sat down, folding his hands on the table. His cold, unreadable gaze locked onto her, and for the first time, Lyra's smirk faltered. "Jewel will be here in 5 minutes, Gunnar said, voice even. Lyra blinked. "Excuse me?" "You got tossed around this morning. If there's something I need to know about your condition, I'd rather find out now." Lyra scoffed. "How sweet. The big bad Alpha is worried about me." Gunnar didn't so much as blink. "Number, I just need to know if you're a liability." The smirk disappeared completely. She clicked her tongue, pushing off the table. "Well, aren't you charming? No wonder Rose has a stick up her ass. You're all business, aren't you?" Gunnar leaned back slightly, his piercing blue eye never wavering. "You made a hell of an entrance, Lyra. You're not going anywhere until I know exactly what I'm dealing with." Lyra rolled her eyes, but before she could respond, the door opened. Jewel strode in like she owned the place, a medical bag slung over one shoulder and her usual no-bullshit expression firmly in place. She didn't look at Gunnar, didn't acknowledge Lyra's lazy smirk. She just dropped the bag on the table, cracked her knuckles and said, "Shirt off." Lyra arched a brow. "At least buy me dinner first." Jewel didn't even blink. "Not my type." Gunnar let out a slow exhale, already regretting this entire situation. Lyra sighed dramatically but obeyed, shrugging off her jacket and rolling up the hem of her shirt, just enough to expose the lines of scars across her torso. Jewel's sharp green eyes flickered over them, assessing. Some were old. Healed knife wounds, long slashes from blades, the jagged scar across her ribs that should have killed her. Jewel pressed her fingers against it, firm but careful. "Draven?" she asked casually. Lyra flinched, just slightly, then scoffed. "Oh, sweetheart, if Draven ever got the chance to kill me, he'd have made it a lot messier." Jewel said nothing, but her gaze was razor-sharp, reading between the lines. She moved to the bruises along Lyra's ribs and jaw, evidence of this morning's mess. Rose's handiwork. "You'll live," Jewel finally muttered, tossing a bandage onto the table. "Unfortunately," Lyra chuckled, pulling her shirt back down. "Oh, you do care." Jewel's expression turned cold. She snapped her medical bag shut, then leveled Lyra with a stare that froze the air in the room. "You might be physically fine," she said. She adjusted the strap of her bag. "But someone who does what you did?" She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to something razor-sharp. "Someone who hands over the person they love like a piece of currency?" Lyra's smile didn't disappear, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Jewel grabbed the bag, slinging it over her shoulder as she turned to leave. "That's not someone with a heart," she said simply. She pulled the door open. "That's someone with a hole where it should be." And then she was gone. Gunnar didn't move. Lyra sat completely still, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she let out a slow, amused breath. "You've got some sharp-tongued women in your little club, don't you?" Gunnar finally stood, chair scraping against the floor as he moved to the door. "You'll be assigned a guest room for now," he said simply. Lyra arched a brow. "Not a cell?" "You're a guest, for now," Gunnar corrected. Lyra smirked. "Oh, I do love those little add-ons." Gunnar didn't react. He just opened the door and gestured for her to move. Lyra didn't argue. She picked up her jacket, slung it over her shoulder, and walked past him with that same effortless swagger. But Gunnar noticed, the way she kept rolling her shoulders like she was shaking off something that had gotten under her skin. Something Jewel had said. He filed that away. For later. For when it really mattered. The door to the small conference room swung open. Gunnar emerged first. Rose my office. Lyra strolled back into the war room like she hadn't just been under Gunnar's scrutiny. She carried herself with the same effortless confidence as always, but there was a tension in her shoulders, just enough to hint that Gunnar's interrogation hadn't been a casual chat. Across the room, Rose stood waiting, arms crossed, the wolves flanking her like a silent, living wall. Lyra slowed, her eyes sweeping over the three massive creatures as she took them in fully for the first time. Her gaze landed on Alpha, the massive dire wolf standing at Rose's side. The legendary predator, long thought extinct, was watching her with sharp, intelligent eyes. Assessing her. She smirked. "Well, well, aren't you a handsome beast?" Alpha remained motionless. The only response was the subtle flick of his ear. Lyra turned her attention to Omega next, who sat beside Katrina's old spot, his bright golden eyes filled with curiosity but no immediate hostility. Then there was Beta. The sleek grey she-wolf didn't just watch Lyra. She glared. Hackles raised ever so slightly, ears pinned back in warning. No patience, no games, no interest in entertaining the rogue assassin's antics. Lyra tilted her head. "And you, sweetheart?" Beta growled. A deep, guttural sound that cut the air like a blade. Lyra paused, surprised for just a fraction of a second before that signature smirk of hers returned. "Ooh, feisty." She barely finished the sentence before Beta snapped her teeth at her, stepping forward, ears flat. Lyra tensed, instinctively reaching for one of her blades, but before she could, Alpha moved. Not aggressively, just firmly. He stepped in front of Beta, his sheer size enough to block her path. He didn't bare his teeth, didn't growl, but his body language was clear. "Stand down." Beta let out a low, annoyed huff, but after a moment she obeyed, though her eyes never left Lyra. Lyra raised an eyebrow, looking between them. "Well, that's interesting." Rose, having watched the whole thing with the same stony glare, finally stepped forward. They were inches apart. Tension crackled between them. Not the kind that ignites, but the kind that smoulders, waiting for a reason to explode. Lyra smirked first, the same smug, insufferable expression that had driven Rose into a rage earlier. "Try not to miss me too much, sweetheart." Her voice was velvet laced with thorns. Rose's lips curled into a slow smirk of her own, her rage no longer raw and uncontrolled but sharp and precise. "Oh, don't worry," Rose leaned in just slightly, voice dropping to something low and lethal. Next time, I won't miss at all. A flicker, just the briefest flicker, of something crossed Lyra's expression. A calculation. A knowing. But then it was gone. Rose didn't wait for a reply. She turned on her heel, heading for the door with Alpha, Beta and Omega falling into step beside her. Lyra, ever the last word type, called after her, "Careful, Emberheart. Wouldn't want you burning down another kitchen in a jealous rage." Rose didn't break stride as she raised her hand and flipped her off. Darren would have been proud. The door swung shut behind her, leaving Lyra alone in the room with the wolves, who were still watching her. She sighed dramatically, stretching her arms. Well, that was fun. Alpha exhaled through his nose. Beta glared harder. Omega? He tilted his head, watching her like she was a puzzle he hadn't quite solved yet. Lyra clapped her hands together. So, do you three take bribes? No. No fun at all? She smirked. But as she leaned back against the table, her gaze lingered on the door Rose had just walked through. For all her bravado, for just a second, something unreadable flickered across her face. Then it was gone, and the war room fell silent once more.